So in this slideshow, we're going to compare the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. So why is the Renaissance considered a turning point in world history? And we'll figure that out by looking at what the world was like before the Renaissance and then what it was like after the Renaissance and kind of compare the big changes that happened. So when we look at art, if we look at before the Renaissance, art was a very Gothic, dark style. The Byzantine style dominated, lots of tiles, lots of architecture, and nearly totally religious. It was very stiff with one dimensional figures. It had less emotion in the people's faces. They used a lot of gold to illuminate the figures instead of shading. There was a lack of perspective, lack of chiaroscuro, that's that shading with the extreme shading versus the extreme light next to each other. It was patronized mostly by the church. So the Catholic Church paid for most of the art at the time. After the Renaissance, there was an increased emphasis on secular or non-religious themes, more looking at the classic Greek and Roman ideals. There was a large use of perspective. Chiaroscuro was used a lot. Increased use of oil paints so that what was being painted looked more real. Much brighter colors were being used, more emotion in the faces of the people being painted, and real people and settings were depicted instead of just characters from the Bible. And this was patronized largely by merchant princes, so people who were, very wealthy, but not necessarily associated with the church. And Renaissance popes patronized Renaissance art as well. So that's why you do see a lot of biblical paintings from the Renaissance period, but you still have merchant princes patronizing the art as well. An example of a before and after of Renaissance art. On the left, you can see a very one-dimensional Mary holding a baby Jesus. There is no perspective here at all. Everybody seems to be on the same flat surface. If you look on the right with the painting of Mary and baby Jesus, you can see in the background there's very real looking farmland, a different landscape in the background, and you can tell it's the background because of that perspective being used. You can also see the shading around Mary's face, the hands, baby Jesus, and the emotion of the baby Jesus looking up at his mother. Technology. Let's look at what technology was like before the Renaissance. They depended heavily on scribes to write down everything. After the Renaissance, there was a wide use of the printing press, and new inventions for exploration of new lands were being created. Here's the Gutenberg printing press. And then for exploration, here's an example of the magnetic compass. The next category that we're going to look in depth at is literature. Before the Renaissance, it was based almost solely on religion. It was written completely in Latin, and the church was the greatest patron of the arts and literature. So the church was responsible for buying the art and paying the artists, as well as paying for the literature to be written. There was little political criticism, and everything was handwritten. After the Renaissance, the literature was more secular or non-religious. The vernacular, which means that it was written in the languages of the regular people, and it covered wider variety of subjects rather than just religion, like politics, art, short stories. It involved a lot of humanism, or that idea of like being well-rounded and the human as a subject, and looking back at the classics of ancient Greek and Roman literature and thought. It focused on the individual rather than religion, and it imitated ancient Greek and Roman literature. It increased the use of the printing press, which meant that people could print propaganda at this point and get it out to a lot of people to kind of criticize the government, criticize the church. And an example of this is William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare, his plays are widely known as, little jabs at the government, not very religious at all, very much focused on love and tragedy and, human nature. The next topic we're going to talk about is religion. Before the Renaissance, religion dominated politics, and it sought unified Christian Europe. It wanted to make everybody in Europe Christian. The church was supreme to the state, so that meant that the state or the nation or the country looked to the church for guidance, not the other way around. And then after the Renaissance, the state is supreme to the church. New monarchs asserted their power over the national churches instead of the other way around. And the Protestant Reformation starts to overthrow the ideas of the Catholic Church, and we'll learn more about this in the next module. There was a rise of skepticism, thinking about what people were saying and not just trusting the first thing that they heard. And the Renaissance popes were worldly and corrupt. An example of religion and art and how it changed from being super religious to kind of looking back to like the thoughts of the ancient Greeks and Romans. If you look at this picture, this is the School of Athens. And in the School of Athens, there are all these great thinkers. Euclid's in here, Aristotle, Socrates. A lot of the ancient thinkers are in this painting. Our next topic is politics. Before the Renaissance, the church was supreme over the state. There were a few blacks who lived in Europe. And after the Renaissance, crusades to regain the Holy Land from the Muslims in the Middle East were going on. After the Renaissance, the state was supreme over the church. New monarchs asserted their control over national churches. And there was this thought about Machiavelli. He was a famous prince at the time. He wrote an entire book called The Prince. And in this book, he proclaimed, the idea of it is better to be hated than to be loved. So his thought was that the government was in charge and the prince was in charge and nobody else. Exploration and expansion of empires happened during this time and were largely patronized by the politicians. They would go and pay for the exploration and the expansion. And we'll talk about this at length later. And then African slavery was introduced to Europe, and we will also talk about this at length later. One of the paintings during this time, this is what one artist thought good government would look like. There are people in the streets, very happy, looking in the local marketplace, walking around peacefully. And then in this second painting, this was his depiction of what bad government would look like. And a lot of it's taken off. You can see, just from age, a lot of the paint has chipped away. But you can see in this top right-hand corner, this is what the tyrant or the prince or the government official is supposed to be. He has, satanic horns sticking out of his head. There's also, they're sitting up here while people are dying in the streets. It looks like there's kind of anarchy. You have military out in the streets kind of beating the people. So art was being used at this time to kind of poke fun at different government styles, whereas before it would not have been used to do that. And this is not religious in any way, shape, or form. This is, more political than it is anything else. And lastly, we're going to look at family roles. Before the Renaissance, man was well versed in only one topic. Farmers, they only knew how to farm, and scribes only knew how to write. Divorce was pretty much non-existent at the time. Marriages were arranged for economic reasons, not for love. So a dad would go and see another dad about arranging a marriage for their son and daughter because it was economically advantageous for both families. The average age for men when they were getting married at the time was mid to late 20s, and the average age for women when married was less than 20 years old, usually 13 or 14. The church encouraged paternal care. So the church was saying that it was the man's job to take care of the family. And many couples did not observe church regulations on marriage, manners, shaped men to please women. You'll hear about chivalry. That was something that was, it came about during the time of knights, um, and, holding the door, making sure that women are taken care of. All of those things, happened before the Renaissance. And there was relative gender equality before the Renaissance. And this had a lot to do with the fact that women were working just as hard as men were and bringing just as much to the table as men were. After the Renaissance, however, the idea of a Renaissance man came into play, where somebody was well rounded in many topics. And it's not like they knew one thing and that's all that they knew. Humanism is an example of that, being very well rounded, knowing all that you can know. Divorce was available in certain cases, whereas before it was not. And marriages were based more on romance rather than economic advantages. The woman was to make herself pleasing to the man, instead of vice versa, where the man was trying to win over the women with his chivalry. There was a gender double standard, which increased during this time. There was increased infanticide, which means that, babies were being killed, usually due to, defects, or that they weren't male and that they were female. Those types of things were happening. The legal status of women during this time declined because they weren't working side by side by the men. They weren't bringing as much to the table. And most women were not affected by the Renaissance. Educated women were allowed involvement, but they were still subservient to the men at the time. Lastly, let's look at this all together and kind of pull a bunch of facts together. So, in summary, though people remained religious, religion wasn't the main focus of everyday society. People began to look at things with more skepticism and thought rather than believing everything that they heard. Education was more valued, as was the ability to read. Literacy became more widespread with the printing press and the availability of text in people's own language rather than in Latin. The Catholic Church became less important than local and national rulers in parts of Europe. And lastly, because people were beginning to think for themselves and could read, they started to question the world around them and wanted to see what else was in the world that they were reading about. So riddle me this. So what? How does this change the world? Why is the Renaissance considered a huge turning point in history? That's going to be a question that you're going to have to answer based on all the stuff that we've talked about in the Renaissance.